Hello, good morning, and welcome to this, the last day of Wigtown's first virtual book festival. I'm Polly Puller, and I'd like to thank all our generous sponsors and supporters, as well as our intrepid, hard-working tech team and all the organisers behind the scenes. As part of the celebrations in this, the year of coasts and waters, this event has kindly been sponsored by Nature Scott. If you've been enjoying the festival and feel able to donate, we'd be most grateful, particularly as it seems we're about to sail through another storm. And it's our hope to continue providing you with stimulating literary events throughout the year to help keep us all sane. Now, Anne Lingard is a zoologist, university lecturer and prolific novelist with a particular fascination and passion for parasites, as well as the life of the seashore, where she loves nothing more than to guddle. For the past decade, her guided shore walks around the Allenby Bay Marine Conservation Zone have proved extremely popular with visitors of all ages. Her latest book, The Fresh and the Salt, The Story of the Solway, has been described by Mark Cocker as a wonderful addition to the literature of place. In glorious descriptive, often poetic prose, she seamlessly weaves the scientific and anecdotal and has collated an intriguing work centred around this vast dynamic estuary, its salt marshes and peatlands, its people, plants and animals, its industry, shipping, culture and history. From the delightful, minuscule, overlooked mud shrimp to the tales surrounding ship's skeletons stranded in the sand, it's an astonishing story. During her event, Anne will be showing a short film, and if you have any questions for her, please do send them in as we go along. A very, very warm welcome to you, Anne, this morning. And you are the first author this year that I have met in the flesh.
Yes, isn't it wonderful?
It is. We're very, very lucky to be here, even though we're sitting far apart.
I know. It's just lovely to be here and meeting a real person and not
know.
looking on Zoom.
I know. It makes quite a difference.
Yes. And thank you very much, the Wigtown Book Festival, for inviting me and for giving me the chance to meet Polly as well. We found we had a lot in common, including use of the word guddle.
Guddle, yes, guddle. It's one of my favourite words, and I think it's a very important facet for life.
It certainly is. Great guddling.
Life skill. So you're going to we're going to look at your film, aren't we?
Yes. Maybe I should just explain what I mean about the Solway. Some people consider the Solway to run essentially from the Mull of Galloway across to St Bees Head in Cumbria. When I talk about the Solway in my book, I'm really considering the upper Solway, which is from just west of Kirkcudbright right across to St Bees. So everything west of that up to Gretna, essentially. Right, so we could start and get a little flavour of the upper Solway, I think.
Lovely.
Right. I'm at Port Carlisle, and Port Carlisle is on the Cumbrian side of the Upper Solway. The reason it's called Port Carlisle is because actually there was a canal which went all the way from here, had a sea lock, and boats came in to the canal and travelled all the way up to Carlisle. It's quite extraordinary now. There's absolutely no trace of a canal anymore. It's all been filled in. It was turned into a railway, bizarrely. So there's a lot of man-made interventions to look at here, but there's a lot of lovely natural history that we'll look at as well. Over there is Scotland, and I'm here at low tide. It's just such a beautiful morning. There are egrets, there are herons, all kinds of waders. Anyway, I flew over Port Carlisle several years ago in a gyroplane, which was actually a rather terrifying experience. It's a bit like flying in a motorbike. There are no sides, and so you're leaning out to take pictures and trying not to wobble too much. And that's a picture I took then at low tide. So I'm sitting just about here with a salt marsh behind me, and there's the entrance to the lock to the old canal. Over here is the stone coaling wharf, and here, the very faint red line there, is the stone quay for the original harbour. And this lump in the middle that we see was actually a pile of stone put there specially to deflect the water as the tide came in and went out, so it would rush round in each direction and help scour out the dock. There's lots and lots of red sandstone around here, and that's something that is so typical of the Upper Solway. Everything is built of new red sandstone. We've also got a lot of wooden stumps here, which are the remains of a pier for paddle steamers. And so we have a lot of human intervention, but it was historical. It's not being used anymore. But the important thing about this area is the mud flats and the salt marshes and how it's always changing. The edges of the Solway are forever changing. Although it's not a very big salt marsh, as you can see, it still shows some of the characteristics. You've got the high up tier, and then there's a lower tier, and then down at the bottom you've got newly forming clumps of salt marsh, set up by grass like spartina, samphire sometimes, and as you move up you get up to the pink thrift, and higher up you get much less salt tolerant plants. There's a whole variety of wonderful plants that live here. It's a very interesting environment, it's very special. It also is very good at protecting the coast because it's cut into with all these creeks which sort of fractal pattern, and they dissipate the power of the waves as they come in, and they protect the coast a bit. But the salt marsh then leads down into the mud flat, and it's the mud flats I love. I mean, when you look at this you think, oh, nothing lives there, does it? It's just mud. But actually, let me show you something. Now look where the point of the trowel is. You can see lots of little holes at the top of little conical projections. Right, I'm going to dig the trowel in, and you can see on the trowel there are loads and loads of burrows, and some of them are actually U-shaped. And if I pull that apart you can see there's a very tiny wiggling things in there with some very long antennae, and these are mud shrimps. They're called carophium. And per square metre you might have 10,000 of these burrows. They are so extraordinary. They're wonderful little engineers. There's another one there. You can just see it wriggling around. They eat algae on the surface of particles. They stir up the oxygen in here. So wherever you've got burrows, you get a good oxygen content. Wherever you haven't got burrows, down at the bottom, it's quite black. Not much oxygen there. So they do a grand job in just engineering this mudflat and making it suitable for not only for themselves in enormous numbers, but for other invertebrate animals. And here you've got the salt marsh and the mud flat, and I sort of think of them as being hand in hand in stabilising the edges of the Solway in a particular way. What I love about coming down to the shore at low tide is we see things that have been happening while we're not here. So you get a sort of snapshot of what's been happening earlier. Look at this, you can see here how the birds have been really busy. As soon as the tide's gone out, they've come scurrying in. These are perhaps knot or dunlin footprints. And you can see where they've been probing here. They've probably been going for ragworms or something like that.
That's lovely. Now, I think if we could have the map again, it would give Anne a chance to just explain exactly where the Solway is and the piece of country you're talking about. There we are.
Right, yes. Now, if you look in the top right-hand corner, you can probably just see the motorway cutting across that corner with Gretna and Carlisle a little bit below it. And just to the west of Carlisle there, Carlisle is actually Port Carlisle, which is where I was in that film. And you can see then it goes around the corner to Bowness on Solway, and across from Bowness is Annan. So you get a rough idea there. I'm really embarrassed to see that on this map I haven't got Wigtown. That's a terrible thing, isn't it? I'm surprised you allow me here, actually. But you can see Kirkcudbright. And of course, in the middle of the Solway, you've got the Robin Rig Wind Farm as well, which has got 58 turbines and is serviced from Workington across the way there. And then down at the bottom you can see St Bees Head. So that gives you a rough idea. You've got some fairly sort of hard margins around St Bees Head with the cliffs, and also around Balcarry Bay and places like that. But pretty much the upper Solway has these really soft edges, which is where you've got all the mud flats and the salt marshes, and it's just totally malleable, changing all the time. It's quite extraordinary, actually.
I found that when I was reading your book, that dynamic aspect to the Solway was so strong. I mean, it is changing the whole time. And how do these little creatures, things like the mud shrimps, how do they cope with the changes of salinity? Because there's so many rivers running. Is it 5 rivers running to the Solway?
It's more like a dozen, actually.
Is it a dozen?
It's quite surprising. Yes, they seem to be reasonably tolerant, but of course they live in the mud. But it's surprising, many of these animals that live in the tops of estuaries are able to cope quite well. And so you've got things like the ragworms and the mud shrimps and the mud snails, and they can cope with changes. And of course, when you've got low tide and there's been a massive rainfall in the fells or elsewhere, then there's a huge amount of fresh water coming down as well. And so there's constant mixing. So, and that's how it is now. But then if you think back 10,000 years ago, when it was glaciated, I mean, this is the other thing about the Solway. It's never been static. The edges have always moved depending on the state of the glaciers, whether they're forming or melting. And, excuse me, the sea level and the land, the two levels are constantly changing relative to each other. When the glaciers melt, you get a whole lot of fresh water coming down, which causes the sea level to rise. But also, of course, the land is no longer pressed down, so the land has this isostatic rebound. Actually, this side is still going upwards by a minute amount. I don't think it'll save us as sea levels rise, actually. So this is always changing, and this has been happening, particularly in the last 10,000 years. So at some stages, the Solway's been very wide. Other times, it's been much narrower and deeper, and so, always you get changes of the relative proportions of fresh and salt water coming into it.
Would you say that as an estuary, it's one of the most, the one that's changing the most out of all the other estuaries around the country?
Gosh, I don't know. I imagine it probably is. The interesting thing is that it's one of the, it's known to be one of the least spoilt, that is, spoilt by humans,
Yeah.
and least industrialised estuaries.
But it was very industrialised. I mean, I found that intriguing. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it had a very, very important industrial era, didn't it?
That's right. It is quite extraordinary now. You go out in the Upper Solway and there's really nothing happening. Or you go down to Workington, Whitehaven, and really there's not a lot to see. Whereas at one stage, I mean, in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, it was seething. Not only were there all kinds of boats bringing in goods from America and all over, there were boats taking out goods, there were fishing boats, large fishing boats, herring boats. It was constantly changing. At Port Carlisle in the 19th century, Port Carlisle was just heaving. There were boats going up the canal to Carlisle itself, and at one stage, apparently, there were about 11 seagoing vessels up at Carlisle. And meanwhile, boats would be coming down the canal with passengers who were going out on steamships to Liverpool and America to emigrate. There was constant transfer of goods there. And so that was sort of on the ship. We've forgotten, I think, that at that time, the sea was the major, where everything happened. It was the portal to the land. Then, of course, the railways developed, and so things shifted onto the railways. And then the railways...
And now we're onto roads, and more roads.
Yeah, I know.
It seems odd that we sort of shun these different modes of transport,
yes.
And then, all the infrastructure that's associated with
yes.
them, and ruin the landscape, really, by carving it up with more roads.
It is a shame, isn't it? And I know at the Port of Workington, when I was there several years ago, they had a big hope that the Port of Workington was going to become what they called a multimodal hub, because you've got the railway, you've got the roads, you've got shipping coming in, and they were hoping that a lot of goods for the new nuclear build at Sellafield, which of course hasn't and never will happen now, will come in. But then, you know, it kind of, they put in a lot of infrastructure for containers, and it really hasn't happened, which is a shame, because it's an obvious way of getting goods in to Cumbria. And the Scottish side, of course, is much less well served. I mean, the ports, essentially you've got Kirkcudbright, which is not like Workington or Sillith. It doesn't have dock gates, so entry is very dependent on high tide and so on. But the other sort of industries I haven't mentioned, of course, in West Cumbria, because you had these massive deposits of iron ore, hematite, and you had the huge coal fields. So it was the iron and limestone on the edge of the Lake District. The lakes are surrounded by this circle of limestone. You had the perfect conditions for making iron and steel. And so there were huge ironworks and steelworks.
Must have been so many people employed at that point. I mean, you mentioned that in your book, the amount of people, and then that's just gone.
That's gone too. And of course, the undersea coal mines off Whitehaven, you know, they were employing thousands of people, not only the miners, but the women who were sorting the coal and all the subsidiary organisations around it. And the ships, of course, taking coal out.
Am I right in thinking they're about to open the first coal mine to be opened again? Is that about to happen?
It's
controversial.
I think it's very controversial. I think I heard yesterday that the Secretary of State has probably stopped it, but I'm not certain exactly what's happening. But that was the West Cumbria mining scheme was using the undersea coal mines, for which so much interesting geological knowledge exists. They were going to use. They were going to get into the mines through former works, and the coal was actually not going to be used for generating power, but for making steel, which of course we always have a need for steel, and until there's a new way of heating iron sufficiently high to make steel, then coal will be needed. So it's a very it's as is usual with these things, it's not black, not white. There are grey areas. And
you're very good in your book at keeping very neutral. I notice, but when you talk about things, you very much let the reader make their own mind up about situations. You talked about Kirkcudbright just now. Am I right in thinking that's the second largest place where they bring in scallops? Is that?
Yes, apparently. Isn't it amazing? So, and if you go down to the port, you know, you see all the scallop boats there,
and you were very, you just discussed scallop dredging, but again, didn't make any decisions. But I mean, that's obviously quite a difficult subject now, because, you know, it is proven that these scallop dredges do damage the seabed horrendously.
Yes.
So what are your views on that? You know, how do you think we can balance that with?
Again, it's very difficult, isn't it? But when you look at the scallop dredges, they're in terms of artwork, they're very interesting, with these extraordinary metal chain dredges.
I find them quite intimidating. I stand there and I look at them and I think they're actually very intimidating, and they just frighten me because I know the damage they do.
That's right. And then you imagine these things being dragged across the bottom. And there are, I mean, now in the Irish Sea there are areas, marine conservation zones, which are supposed to be protected from dredging and trawling and so on. But of course, with all these things, it's a question of policing it and making sure that the rules are adhered to. And the marine protected areas in Scotland, and there are many places where it seems that, you know, people are still able to go and trawl and dredge, and you need some teeth.
Yes, you do. You do. You talk a lot about the herring industry too, and I mean the descriptions in your book about some of the places, how there would be all these herring boats and the massive amount of herring being landed. And that's all gone
That's
too.
Gone.
Yeah.
Yes, there are no herring. I was trying to find out from the Marine Management Organisation in Whitehaven when they had reports of herring coming in, and they really couldn't remember. So, it might be 20 years, 30 years. I'm not even certain when herring last came into the Firth. But they used to come in enormous numbers and on a sort of 10-year cycle quite often. And my wonderful friend Ronnie Porter, who lives at Allenby, I mean, he's 80-ish now, and he remembers, that how they would take the herring nets down the shore and stake them, anchor them on the shore, which is wonderful. So these horses and carts were taking the nets down, putting them down, and they would swing with the tide, and then they would go down at low tide and pull them up again. And he said sometimes they were just glittering with herring. And this went on for years. And of course, at Allenby, they had herring salting works too, and smokeries and so on. But he talks wonderfully about how he used to set off on his bike, didn't have 18 gears in those days, and going up onto the higher plain, the parts just beyond the Solway Plain, with herring and other fish hanging from his handlebars to sell, to get money to go to the pictures.
You met some fabulous characters. I really enjoyed particularly the interviews you did with some of the characters, and such a diverse lot of characters. And I think what really struck me about the whole book was that the Solway is so many different things to so many different people. If you meet a bird slung about with his binoculars, and when it's very important for completely different reasons than the herring fishers and the people whose livelihoods really depended on it.
Yes. I mean, I feel myself incredibly privileged to have met so many interesting people. I mean, I've talked to ship's pilots and harbour masters and people who do the surveys of the Solway's bottom for the ships to go up. I've talked to hand peat cutters and quarriers and sculptors and huff-netters, and it's just been absolutely wonderful, really.
Was there one particular person who you felt really very, very special? I mean, that's a difficult question.
It is a difficult question,
somebody who's really... well, a lot of them were a dying breed, weren't they?
Yes,
which is
I'm
quite
afraid
sad.
So, and it's been
real country people. Some of them.
And I've been very fortunate to capture their stories. I think Ronnie, I was talking about with the herring fisheries, but he also remembered all the names of the stones along the shore.
That was intriguing.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you've got these great boulders, they're glacial erratics, probably from Criffel, and dropped by the glaciers. And they've all got their names like Maston and Hanging Stone and Coping Stone and Archie and Pintle, which I later discovered meant penis, which I didn't know. So I won't go bandying around Pintle.
No.
But even the rocky scars, which are kind of small boulder fields deposited by the glaciers when they were treated, all these along the shore, and the altar stone on the Annan side, they all have their names. And they're either... I mean, the altar stone acts as a boundary marker, but the ones on the Cumbrian side, if you were putting out your pots or your baited lines or your herring nets, then you would know that I put it by Maston, or I put it on anchor scar or metal stones, and so that's how people, knew where they put things. And also the people who put out their herring nets, they had particular parts on the shore that they could use.
I mean, extraordinary. It's a whole culture, isn't it? I mean, your book is very much social history too. I mean, there's a lot of that, isn't there? Very much so.
And the peat cutters, and I mean, that's an interesting story, because when you think of the Solway, you don't think of peat, do you?
No, you
but
don't.
Of course, when the glaciers were treated, they left hollows, essentially. I mean, the classic source of the Solway's moss is these hollows, which then filled with water and sphagnum moss and vegetation. And gradually the sphagnum built up and up and up, forming the peat. And it was often 10 metres thick, and these great domes of peat. They're known as the raised mires, or they're actually known as the mosses, with the capital M. And you've got them on both sides of the Solway. They are extraordinary areas, very, very beautiful, very big. You can go out in the middle of them and you just feel you're in another world, actually. It's quite amazing. The animals, the birds, the vegetation, the plants, yes.
Dragonflies.
Yes, that's right.
Insects.
And the colours of the sphagnum, just beautiful. But of course, it's only latterly, really, I suppose the last 20, 30 years, we've come to appreciate how important the bogs, the peat bogs are, not in terms of, of sequestering carbon is what is important these days. But we think about, but also, the extraordinary biodiversity and the beauty of the habitats. But prior to that, peat, of course, was, a resource to be used. And people had turbary rights around the edges. They could go and cut peat for their fires, of course, for fuel. And then there was... Then the commercial peat cutting came in.
I think that was more frightening, wasn't it?
Yes.
I didn't sort of have any... I think when it's just cutting for your fire, it's sort of slightly more acceptable. But this mass harvesting, where they're stripping the peat bogs...
That was a little bit later, really. The 2 or 3 of the people I talked to were hand peat cutters. So there were companies that employed men to come in with all these amazing tools. The names and the shapes of the tools and themselves are fascinating, and that's, of course, well known in Scotland too. And
but they'll be different, won't they? They'll be
different. Yes, that's right, slightly different. And, of course, the ones on Lewis have wonderful names too. But so they would come in, and it was a very, very skillful job.
And hard work.
Extremely
hard work.
And their feet, they wore these boards on their feet. So because they were paddling. And, the thing about peat is it's 95% water. And as long as it's intact, that's all trapped in there. But as soon as you cut a face, it's like making a wound. And there are channels in it, and the water starts flowing out. And when the Solway Junction Railway was built across Bowness Common, Bowness Moss, they cut longitudinal, the navvies cut longitudinal ditches each side of the track, and horizontal ditches. And it was said that the water flowed in river-like streams into the Solway and the River Wampool. And, it just was pouring out of the moss, and so destroying the peat. And so these peat works, they were doing the same. But the lovely thing about these men is what they liked being out there. And, they have such... I have marked here a little piece. I just read there were 2 peat cutters I talked to. And Patrick, he says, and you'd see all the wildlife, cuckoos. My dad would never disturb cuckoos. There were dragonflies and adders there too. The only thing my dad would grumble about would be the midges. But he'd have his pipe and he'd puff the smoke. Even in the rain, it was good. For Thomas, mind you, I enjoyed it. There was a lot of freedom. There was nobody chasing you like. What I liked about it as well, there was always a lot of birds there. There were cuckoos in summer nesting in the meadow pipit's nests. They nested in the stacks. There were wagtails nesting there too. And I remember another thing, all the snakes, adders. One fella said he'd chopped more snakes in 2 than he'd hardly cut peat. The adders would be curled up on the path and they slithered away when you came. There are not many adders left now.
And it's such a shame because they're just such beautiful, beautiful.
I think I've seen 3 adders.
And was it there when you in that area, or was it somewhere else?
I didn't see the adders there, but I saw them in a moss quite close by.
I think the Isle of Jura is still a stronghold for adders.
It?
Yeah, and there's a place quite near where we live where you can see
beautiful?
them. They're just incredible.
Just lovely. The second one I saw just last year, it was just curled up in the sun, and it just kind of raised its head and looked at me, and then just slithered away.
Because I don't know why we're so frightened of them, because unless you happen to go and sit on one or stand on one, it's really not going to do anything to you.
No, they're much more scared of us than we are.
Quite interesting that you talk about them building, being able to build across this peat, because I know they tried to put a road or a railway across Ranach Moor, and I think the whole thing just sank in.
Yes.
It just was impossible, and still hasn't been done, thankfully.
No, thank goodness. Well, the Solway Junction Railway took them many years more. The viaduct across the Firth was finished, and the railway on the Scottish side and the railway as far as, I think, Wampool on the English side was finished, and they still hadn't finished building across Bowness Moss because, it was like Chatsworth Moss, is it? I forget, down near Manchester, where it took them years again. And what they were doing, not only were they draining it each side, these poor navvies, but they were also putting piles, I think 90,000 faggots, these bundles of wood were put across. And in some places they were putting double-length sleepers and then sleepers on top, and it goes sinking and ballast. And there are all these lovely stories about the train with the engineers and the inspector going across, and the train's kind of sinking in, and lovely descriptions in the newspapers about it more or less clawed its way out again, and it took them a long time to deem it safe.
They were tenacious, a bit like the people that built lighthouses. I mean, all those crews that
was
built
the Victorians.
Yes, incredible.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to thank them for, or maybe not. There's a question come in here for you, Anne.
Oh, right.
And it was, what did you find the most surprising thing when you were researching this book? It's rather a nice question.
That's a lovely question. Goodness. Lots of things surprised me, actually. And even now, things surprise me. And I think, I'd like to find out more about that. That's the nice thing about it, actually. The more you find out, the more you
need to write another book now. The second part 2.
Son of Solway. Goodness, that's a very interesting question.
Quite a difficult question, because I'm sure there were a lot of surprises.
On surprises, after talking to people, I think for example, I took, in the final chapter of the book, one of the things I do is talk to some wildfowlers. And I went out wildfowling on the salt marshes a couple of times on the English side. And you go out in the dark, and it is very, very cold. And this was in February both times. And I'd sort of always had this vision of wildfowlers going out with their guns and, standing like with piles of dead geese, But it's not like that at all. And the thing that really intrigued me was at least 2 people said to me, and I know you'd say, they would say that, wouldn't they? But they said to me, it's the being out there that they loved. And in a sense, it was because they were out there in these very difficult, harsh conditions, and they would be waiting for the sound of the birds and to pick out the different calls and determine whether or not it was a bird that was could be quarry, could be something they shot at. But it was also that feeling of being out in this wilderness, I suppose. And can I just read another little quote here from one of the wildfowlers? Because I was actually very moved about this. He said, I just like being out here and being part of it, the early morning, the solitude of it. It's an environment that's alien to us, and 95% of the time the wildfowl have the advantage. There was one morning when about 4,000 pink feet, geese that is, lifted off. What a sight, I said to the dog. Look at that. And if you only remember one thing in your life, remember that. And he just told me that, how he'd said it to his dog, and his dog was curled up there in this creek with us, with a cow. And I thought, that's quite an extraordinary thing, actually, and that's one of the most moving things I've heard. I was really surprised, actually.
Yes, I enjoyed reading that bit. As you say, it was very, very moving. Of course, the Solway is an incredibly important area for geese, particularly the barnacle goose, isn't it? And the biggest wintering place in the country, isn't it? More barnacle geese. Well, Isla are also pretty important.
And of course the pink feet geese from the Arctic as well. And so huge numbers, tens of thousands come over. And they've been coming over recently. It's a lovely sound, isn't it? When I hear them, they come over our house, coming over the Solway, and in the distance you hear this wink, 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 and you look up and you see these V's, ever-shifting forms of the pink feet, and coming in, and they're always disputing. We'll go this way. No, we won't. We'll break up. We'll go that way. And it's
extraordinary what drives them, isn't it? That amazing. And there's always one goose at the front of the
Yes.
V that seems to, I suppose if it got out of line, the whole formation would go to
Well,
pot.
they're always changing, actually.
Yeah.
And, of course, they overwinter here on the Solway and they graze on the salt marshes. And a lot of the conservation work on Rockcliffe and the marshes around here and over at RSPB Campfield on the other side is a lot of the work is done to keep the salt marsh grass at a particular level so that the geese will enjoy will be able to graze on it. And there is, of course, as you can imagine, there are some nice barley fields a little further in too, where they're not maybe quite so welcome to graze on the winter barley.
It is a very difficult thing to get a good balance between the two. Of course, it's not always easy for conservationists to see that in fact other people are trying to make a livelihood. So there will always be conflict, I think, with geese, but they are wonderful. So. And I love the fact that at the end of the summer, when we're all feeling a bit nostalgic that the swallows have gone and will they come back next year? And then suddenly you're out and you see the fieldfares and the redwings and the geese. And you think, actually, it's pretty fantastic now too.
It is. And Twitter is always full of people with photos of geese and they're back.
I know. So there's a great excitement surrounding them, and they are absolutely beautiful things. And they were used a lot in folklore too, weren't they? And all sorts of things like that. I mean, geese, there's a great history with them, a long, long, long history.
That's right.
The extraordinary, you're so keen on all the wonderful things on the shore, as I am too, but you know all the scientific names and I don't. Goose barnacles. Yes. I find it astonishing that people actually believe that these molluscs, that geese actually hatched out of them.
Yes,
would you like to tell people about that? Because it is an extraordinary story.
Yes, I mean, they occasionally get thrown up on the tide line, and the larvae attach to floating objects. And one of my best things I found was a sandal, and it was just covered in goose barnacles. And it must have drifted across from the Atlantic from the American side, because they're not naturally found in this country, the goose barnacles. But they have these black stalks and a black and white shell. So, and a barnacle goose is black and white and very delicate looking. It's a bizarre idea.
But sailors actually used to say that they saw the geese taking flight out of them. So I don't know there must have been too much rum in those days on those ships.
Something
to keep
like
warm.
that. Yes.
Yeah. Now we've got another question here, Anne, from Astrid. What do you think the up-and-coming industries of the Solway are? That's a bit difficult.
It is difficult, that's right. Well, at the moment there's a big wind farm, Robin Rig, and there's a possibility that might be extended. That's still under discussion, of course. The other thing would be tidal power schemes. That's probably the next big thing, but whether it will happen depends on the governments on both sides of the Firth. A few years back, Tidal Power Swansea put forward ideas for tidal lagoons, and they had five sites, and if the Swansea one went ahead, then the Solway Firth would have been one of the next ones. The Swansea Lagoon has been discussed and nearly there, and then the government have pulled back, and the funding keeps disappearing, and so on. I don't know what's going to happen. There's another scheme for a lagoon. There are two sorts of lagoons, essentially. There's a Russell Lagoon, like the Swansea one. There's another proposal for that. That's like a horseshoe joined on each end to the land. And there's also has been proposals for donut-shaped lagoons. But just last week, I read a letter from the CEO of that company saying that it was never going to go ahead. The government was not interested in funding it. And they thought floating tidal power schemes would be the future. So who knows? I mean, the technology is always changing. I've been horrified, really, that as an island nation, an archipelago, we're so behind on our technology for tidal power. You know, we could have been streets ahead. We could have been devising undamaging ways of doing this. Because if there were a tidal power scheme in the Solway, any man-made intervention in the Solway, because it's such a very sediment-laden firth, any man-made intervention causes huge changes in the margins, in the channels and so on. And of course, all of the upper Solway is multiply protected with international, European, national conservation designations. It's an incredibly important area. And so, any intervention in the firth is going to cause changes, which might be very good. I mean, the mud shrimps would be happy.
Yeah, the mud shrimps.
But so I would have said that probably tidal power schemes would be the next industrial scheme.
And you do think that would have the least environmental impact of all the various things? I mean, does do these things affect cetaceans and their movements? Because I know there's been more and more strandings and more whales and dolphins found in dire straits.
That's right.
Around our coasts, and you do wonder if what we're doing is what's affecting this.
Yes, I just don't know. The other industry that is being very strongly pushed, of course, is the service industry of tourism.
Yeah.
And on both sides, all the councils very much trying to increase tourism numbers. And I can see the reasons for doing this. As somebody who loves the emptiness of the upper Solway,
not so enthusiastic.
I'm personally not so keen on that, but then it's not up to me, and I'm getting on in years. So.
Exactly. Do you think that when it comes to natural history and wildlife and nature matters, do you think that we should have areas in the country where no one is allowed to go, where nature is just allowed to get on with it?
Wouldn't that be a lovely idea? Yes.
Because
yes, I do.
I mean, often we kill the goose that lays the golden egg, don't we, by advertising these beautiful places, and then they do get spoiled.
Yes. So probably nobody should read the book.
No, you're very, very good. You don't judge at all, and I think that's very admirable, because you do let the reader decide what's best for. But I mean, the Solway is very, very special for wildlife, and increasingly so as the country shrinks, the habitat shrinks.
That's right. And of course, there are lots of pushes to have these wildlife corridors, nature recovery corridors, which I think are tremendously important. And there are good things happening there, but then you get HS2.
Oh, I know. We won't talk about that. There's another question here for. So yes, on that point, Anne, what's the impact on the local environment? So I think that's talking about the industries. I think so. That's what is the? I think we've sort of covered that.
I think we've pretty much covered that.
Yes, we have. Now I do not want to miss out on a little bit more in-depth chat about the mud shrimps. We go back to them because we were going to chat about them. And they're the parts of the names of all their parts. Now, you had a wonderful song written about them, which we weren't able to play today due to technical issues. But would you like to tell us a little bit more about the mud shrimps and their tiny little things with these incredible names for all their body parts?
That's right. We saw them then in that video at the start. And they grow up to about 1 centimetre long, and they can be as many as 10,000 or more per square metre, which is quite do it. So she did it all herself on her iPhone, all these multiple layers. It's absolutely fantastic.
It's worked really brilliantly.
It does. It's lovely. So do, go on to the website of the Fresh and the Salt, and you'll find it there. It's just a lovely thing to listen to.
Now, tell me a little bit about your shore walks. I mean, obviously they've had to stop with the recent carry-on, but that's been something that obviously you've been really enthusing people, and people have just loved going with you. So you take people out, and what happens? What do you do?
Well, I find the days when there's a really good low spring tide at a sociable hour. Unfortunately, the Solway's really good low tides tend to be between 6 and 8 in the morning.
Perfect.
Which it's lovely, but of course it has to be in summer, because if it's dark, you can't see anything. We have done a few evening ones as well. And it has to be, the weather's good, and I have to be around. And so there are lots of things that have to fit together. And I usually take a maximum of 10 people, and we meet up and we walk down as far as we can to the low tide level, usually in Allenby Bay, where there are these big honeycomb worm reefs, which is why Allenby Bay is a marine conservation zone. And I try not to get distracted by seeing things on the way. You know, a bit of a authoritarian. We'll route march down. Nobody's to guddle until we get down to the bottom, and then we get down there and we just look to see what's around. And the honeycomb worm reefs are absolutely wonderful things. But there are also things like burrowing anemones and sponges and, you know, so many different creatures living there. And on the hard rocks, like the rocks we were talking about earlier, you've got things like mussels and dog whelks and barnacles, you know. And we look at them and we think why they're living there and so on. And the lovely thing is that in every group you nearly always get someone who's good at seeing, good at spotting. And this person will be saying, "Oh, look what I've got. What's this?" And I just love that. And I've got actually on my Solway Shorewalker blog, I've got a section just of hands holding things out, because it's fascinating what people find and what intrigues them, and everyone gathers around. You know, there's this thing to look at.
It must give you a lot of pleasure, because you are connecting people to the natural world and to looking. I think, you know, a lot of us charge around and don't look, you know. Often when I'm out with people doing wildlife things, you know, I'll say, "Oh, there was a badger there last night and this was that." And they say, "Well, how do you know?" Because they don't look. It isn't that they don't know, they just don't look. And I think you're opening people's minds, and I think that's a very calming thing too. And I think we're going to need a lot more of looking at what's around us.
That's a nice idea, that it's calming. Yes, I think it probably is.
But it takes you out of all the things that give you stress and worry. I mean, you go out. I think what I love about going out on walks in the natural world, whether it's the shore or whether it's up the hill or wherever it happens to be, you set off thinking you want to go and see one particular thing, and within 2 minutes you've been sidetracked by something else you've seen. You describe robin's pincushions on a briar bush in your book as well, and that's something that most people wouldn't even notice.
Possibly not, no.
Do you want to explain what a robin?
Oh, it's a
lovely thing.
Plant parasite. It's an insect parasite.
Wasp,
It's a gall wasp, yes, which make on wild roses. You see this kind of lovely, almost fluffy redness, don't you?
It's a sort of red hairdo.
Yes,
it's a sort of mad
it's a wonderful thing. Usually that's it's lovely. But going back to what you were saying about when you go out and people ask you why you know about the badger's been there, because you've seen a paw print which is so distinctive, or something like that, or even a latrine, which is very distinctive.
Pits, yes.
Badger. But you know, that's the other thing on the shore, that if you go down at low tide, you see what has been happening. For example, you might see funny little sideways scrape marks which show you where, you know, how crabs move sideways, so their feet have been scraped. Or you see something that looks like a mountain bike tread, which is where a large ragworm has gone, because they've got their feet, if you like, stick out at the sides, and they've got very sinuous bodies. And sometimes you see a whole lot of these and you think, "Oh, what have they been up to?" And then you find a ragworm egg. So you see all these things. It's like a snapshot of what went on at low tide. And then you have, I mean, that's the other thing I love, is you then have to start imagining what happens when the tide comes in. Because, you know, on the biggest spring tides, you might be getting as much as 10 metres of water coming in and going out twice a day,
Incredible.
Which is a terrific amount of water. And so, you know, you've got these animals there, and you think particularly about the sedentary, the sessile ones like barnacles or the honeycomb worms, which are in their tubes on the reefs. And gradually this water is coming in, and they sense that, and they're starting to get active. The mud shrimps will be doing it too. And gradually this water is coming in, and it's very silty, but it's bringing food. It might be bringing planktonic larvae, predators, parasites, unpleasant things like oil, you know, all kinds of things like that. And also swishing around good nutrient matter. And this is just rising and rising and rising above them. It's a huge water column rising. And then, of course, you've got all the active animals like the fish and so on coming in as well. And the ragworms will start scurrying around. And then after a while, then the water's going down again. And so they go back into their state of quiescence. And have to
so
wait.
adaptable, really,
Yes.
because if you think about it too, sometimes in the heat of the summer, you know,
Yes.
they have to be able to cope with desiccation. And that's always amazed me, that they can be dried out and then the tide comes back and then the storms that come and everything.
Yes.
I mean, it is quite
Yes.
astonishing when you
and the
think
ice
about it.
too. I mean, this, one of the reasons the Solway Junction viaduct across the Firth didn't do very well was in 1881 it got almost smashed by huge plates of ice that came down. Obviously, on the neap tide, it had been extremely cold, and there had been huge plates of ice over the salt marshes and the mud. And when the spring tides came, they kind of lifted these plates up. Some of them, you know, they're feet long, and came swooshing down on those big tides and crashed into the viaduct and sloshed backwards and forwards for 3 days, smashing it. And then you think of all the animals that were living in the mudflats and salt marshes and having to cope with this. It's quite extraordinary.
And of course, now we've got all these invasive non-native species coming in as well, which you talk about in your book, and about the threats that they bring to our native things. I think a lot of people don't realise that the huge amount of shipping and boats moving around, that these things attach themselves to hulls and come from other parts of the world, and some of them survive.
In ballast water too.
Yeah,
I think yachtsmen and fishermen are probably quite well aware of this, because there are a lot of posters and warnings and information to look out for things. But I think actually, you know, things like Himalayan balsam on land too. I think our attitude's going to have to change to this. We call them invasive non-native species. But with the climate changing, the oceans warming, the sea level rising, this is going to become much more common. We just have to get used to it.
Yeah.
And somehow everything will adapt. It might take centuries, but
yeah, you're right.
we might not even be around to see it.
No, I think probably we won't be around to see it.
It is.
I'd love, just before we finish, really would like you to tell us a little bit about the grazing animals that go down onto the salt marshes and the stints. I found the stints very fascinating, and it's an extraordinary idea.
Yes, the stints. This is particularly on the Cumbrian side, where sheep and cattle can graze on the salt marshes. And I had a lovely day going out on the stints on the salt marshes at Newton Arlosh on the Cumbrian side, up near the top. And the lady I went with was secretary for the Newton Arlosh and Saltcote Marsh Stint Marsh Committee. And various people own areas of land on the salt marshes. And different salt marshes you're allowed to graze sheep, some you can graze cattle, but some you can't. You know, it varies a lot. Newton Arlosh is cattle, basically. And we had this lovely conversation, because the stints they're auctioned out, the grazing is auctioned out in about May, and they're only grazed from May to September, May to October. And I asked this lady, Eileen, I said, well, how big is a stint? And she said, well, it depends on the amount of grass on it. So I might have 3 stints, but I would call them 4.5, because each stint is equivalent to 1.5 stints of grazing. So there's all this very complicated thing. And then when they're auctioned, the auctioneers are not allowed to say how many stints to be auctioned, which is absolutely
clandestine, wasn't it?
I know,
found
because
it
that affects
intriguing.
the price.
Yeah.
And, because I said to Eileen, how many stints are there? And she said, I'm not going to say.
Do you think it comes
It's
from the
very
word
funny.
stint? You know, don't stint.
I don't know where it comes.
It's a funny word,
But it's
isn't it?
fascinating, isn't it? And I just love the idea. And then each marsh has a herdsperson, known as the herd, who goes out in his quad and with his dogs and keeps an eye on the animals. And there are all kinds of complicated rules about what, cows can't be in calf, because you can't allow a cow to calf way out on a
it gets washed away.
And there's also kinds of complications with the marshes getting inundated at high spring tides and so on. So it's a very, very complex system of grazing, actually. It's fascinating.
I mean, I was intrigued also that the fact that salt marsh lamb, I mean, I've known that for a while, is very popular, isn't it? And it's supposed to have a completely different flavour. I suppose it's like North Ronaldsay sheep that eat seaweed.
That eat seaweed, yeah.
I always wonder about the sheep kept on the salt marshes. It must get terrible foot rot, but then maybe the iodine counteracts that.
Yes, I think that they're certainly quite healthy on the marshes. And it was always one of the things about stints was that for the cattle, I think, was that the cattle were thought to be a lot healthier and fewer parasites being kept out there.
Very natural. It's a sort of lovely natural place to keep. Have you eaten salt marsh lamb?
I haven't, actually. I don't know if it even exists anymore.
Yes, I think it does, because I see it advertised in the butcher in Wigtown at the moment. It says new season salt marsh lamb in.
Oh, well.
And how important do you think that the use of science in your writing, because you use, you have a very clever mixture of science and anecdote, which I found very interesting indeed. How important do you think it is to include science in your writing?
Oh, it's absolutely essential. I mean, I speak as a scientist, I trained as a scientist, and I did a zoology degree, then a PhD, and then at Glasgow University I was lecturing and running a research group. And I've always felt it's tremendous. I suppose it comes from lecturing in a way. You've got to be able to get ideas across simply, I think, and interestingly, which I hope I did.
Yes, you do, definitely.
and I think that's really important whenever you're talking to people about not to dumb down. And actually, people who are non-scientists do enjoy the words. That's what we were talking about. And after I left science, I took voluntary severance from academia in Glasgow in order to write and broadcast. My husband agreed to support me, luckily, and our children. But I felt it was tremendously important in fiction writing to use science, to use scientists. Because I always said, if you wrote a novel about an accountant, it wouldn't be about accountancy, would it? So you can put a scientist in a novel and they can still be having a life. I mean, scientists have lives. They're normal people. They're women, they're babies, And so I always worked very hard to do that in fiction. And for some years, I was lucky enough with a collaborator. We had some money from Nesta, National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, and we set up a big nationwide project called SciTalk, which scientists wrote short pieces about themselves on this website, and fiction writers could get in touch and visit their labs and actually see them working, talk to them, and we had wonderful fun. Some wonderful collaborations came out of it. There were 2 subtle science short story competitions. Awful thing to say if you've got a lith. And one of which The Guardian sponsored, another of which Science Magazine sponsored. So it was a tremendous thing. But as with all these projects, you get the money to set them up, and then the money dries up. And we kept it going, paying for it ourselves for a while, but then we had to give up.
Well, I think you've done a brilliant job on this book, and I want to thank you so much for joining us here in the Wigtown studio, and it's been so delightful not doing it just over a machine. It's just absolutely lovely to actually have met somebody this festival. So thank you so much for joining us. I just want to remind everybody that you can buy The Fresh and the Salt from either our festival bookshop, and they can send it to you, or any bookshop, preferably independent, please, because we want to keep supporting independent bookshops. I really do recommend it. I hope to see you all in person next year. But for now, wherever you are, we're really grateful for the support you have given us this year, and I hope the next few months are not too trying for you. Thank you so much, and thank you, Anne.
And thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye.